Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you for participating in our webinar tonight. I'm Claudia Loomis, co-owner of Cherrybrook. It is my pleasure to be your moderator this evening. Our guest is Jody Langelotti, Director of Marketing and Education at Raw's Pet Food. Jody will be sharing her wisdom and extensive experience with us tonight as we explore what's in the bag. This will be an interactive session. We will be asking you all several questions throughout the presentation. Your answers will help Jody frame her discussion. There will be time at the end of Jody's formal presentation for Jody to answer some of your specific questions. Just some light housekeeping before I turn it over to Jody. Jody's formal presentation should be about 45 minutes. Before we begin the Q&A, we will show a short 2-minute video from the founders of Raw's, Jim and Janet Scott. You do not need to wait until the end of the presentation to type your questions into the chat bar. You can type your questions throughout the presentation. If we do not get to answer all your specific questions tonight, I welcome you to email me directly, and I will do my best to answer your questions or direct you to resources that will be able to help. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Jody and get started. Jody, tell us a little bit about yourself so we can get started.
Excellent. Happy to do so. Thank you for having me here this evening. So, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is, again, Jody Langelotti. I'm the Director of Marketing and Education for Raw's Natural Pet Food. I grew up in this industry, working at retail, showing and training dogs, and I've been on the manufacturer side for a couple years now. I've been on the distributor side, and my background with dogs starts from not, when I was a kid, but my first dog as an adult is the cute little border collie puppy that you see in that upper left-hand corner looking up at you. And she started to develop some allergies, and I really had to start learning what was in the food that I was feeding and starting to figure out a little bit more about how do we decipher what we're feeding based on what's on the information on the bag. And the picture below, the little puppy picture, is her as a 14-and-a-half-year-old adult. Unfortunately, we lost her in April. But she was able to live a very long and healthy and full life because of the quality nutrition that she was feeding. The next picture that you see of the little puppy there in a little tote in a truck, his name is Hank. We got him last year in October. He was an owner surrender. He had parvo, and he almost didn't make it. That's a picture of him in the vet's office below with the cone and the little tube in his nose. And if you're not familiar with parvo, it essentially destroys the lining of the stomach, and it can be fatal. But that is Hank there. Next picture to the right there, his big beefy self now, just over a year old. And you can see a shiny coat, and he's really filling out muscularly. And again, it has to do with the quality of nutrition that he's been consuming. And then I couldn't leave out our cat Meow, who loves to rip into bags of food. And then our Basenji Leela, who's 11-and-a-half years old, who likes to sit on top of Hank. So it's, there's a lot we can learn from what we're looking at when we look at a label of pet food, but it can be really, really, really confusing. So we can go ahead and move on, and let's dive in. This evening, we're going to be talking about the anatomy of a pet food label. So if you're able to grab a bag of pet food, if you have your pet's food nearby, you can kind of follow along, but I'll also be showing you a bag. We'll go full screen with my face here, and I'll be able to show you what I'm talking about and really point out what you can learn from the bag. We'll talk about confusing terms and concepts, and we'll talk about what's the best food for your pet look like and how do we apply what we're learning. And then just at the very end there, we're going to talk about the Raw's difference.
Okay. Our first poll question is, what do you learn from the front of a pet food bag? The brand and flavor of the food, the quality of the food, the ingredients in the food based on the pictures of on the label. Give everybody a second to answer and the poll. 85% of our participants this evening understand that that what you gain from looking at the front of the bag is the brand and the flavor of the food, and 7% each believe that it's the quality and the ingredients.
All right, great. So let's talk about this. So first of all, great job on your responses. So if you have a bag of food handy, I'm going to use mine here as sort of the example. So when we look at the front of a bag there, and I'm sorry, it's going to be backwards, I think possibly because of the camera, but hopefully you'll get the idea here. So we definitely learn the brand and the flavor of the food. Typically, we'll see something about like here for ours on our bag, it's dehydrated chicken, turkey, and chicken. When we see pictures of the ingredients on the front of the bag, I hate to inform you that these are not the actual ingredients that are in your food. Now, there may be a picture of beautiful chicken breast and there is chicken in your food, but obviously the images that are on the front are really done for marketing purposes to entice you, the person with the wallet that goes to the store and can pay to buy that food. And unfortunately, we really can't tell a whole lot about the quality of the food from the front of the bag. We can start to get some clues though. For example, on Roz's bag, we do list the first 7 ingredients here. And we make some call outs about no meals, no added chicken fat. And so that does start to give you an idea of the quality. But unfortunately, when you see terms like holistic or natural, these don't necessarily give you an idea as to the quality of the food. And in some cases, a word like holistic is actually only able to be part of the name of the food. And it doesn't actually give us that true indicator of the quality. But again, we can learn, obviously, the size of the food. We can also learn lots of times, like this is for all life stages and all breeds. So we can sometimes learn, who that food is intended to feed. But we're not going to get a whole lot of information on the quality of the food necessarily.
Okay. Our next question is, what can you learn from the guaranteed analysis? So it's time to flip that bag over. I think either that or it's on the side panel.
Yeah, it's either going to be on the back or the side panel. And this is where you're going to see numbers.
Okay. Let's give our participants a few moments to answer.
You might hear my family whispering in the background. They're trying very hard to be quiet.
Okay, 94% of our participants this evening feel that the percentage of the nutrient in the food by weight is what you gain from looking at the guaranteed analysis.
Awesome, outstanding. So that is accurate. So I'm going to show you the guaranteed analysis here. In this case, it's on the side panel. Yours might be on the back. And again, I know it might be backwards, but you can see that we're seeing protein, fat, fiber, and then some other things listed as well. So on the guaranteed analysis, we are truly only seeing the percentage of the weight of the product that's taken up by these nutrients, and specifically the macronutrients, the bigger nutrients, your protein, your fat, your fiber, your moisture. And then the micronutrients, which might be certain vitamins or minerals. It could be glucosamine, chondroitin. We see those on more of like a milligram, kilogram type basis. So something to keep in mind is that AAFCO, the American Association of Feed Control Officials, they regulate pet food labeling. They also set the nutritional minimums and standards for pet food, actually for all animals. So farm animals, fish, everything. Only requires 4 things to be on the guaranteed analysis. And those are the first 4 that are listed. So if you look at the guaranteed analysis on your bag, again, I know it's backwards, you're going to see protein, fat, fiber, moisture. Those are the only 4 things that need to be listed. So why might a company list more? Here on the Roz bag, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 things listed. Why would we have those things listed? Well, when a company wants you to know, for example, how much vitamin E for skin and coat is in there, or how many omega-3 or 6 fatty acids also for skin and joint, or glucosamine and chondroitin for hip and joint health, they're going to put that on the guaranteed analysis. And it can't just be marketing. If at any time that bag is pulled from the shelf and tested by FDA and USDA officials, which does happen, it must meet those levels, either the minimum or the maximum that's listed. And so it's actually in the bag, but it's going to vary from brand to brand. So if you find a brand that only has 4 things listed on the guaranteed analysis, that doesn't mean that that it's not a good food. It just means that they're only listing those 4 required things on the guaranteed analysis, and hopefully we can find out more information from their website.
Let's talk about the ingredients. The ingredient list tells us both the quality and the amount of an ingredient in the food. True or false? Well, the early indicator is that 100% of our participants this evening believe that to be false. That you cannot, 88%. The ingredient list tells us both the quality and the amount of an ingredient in the food. True or false? Okay, 89% of our participants this evening believe that to be false statement, and 10% believe it to be true.
So great responses. And it's a little bit of a trick question because there are some ingredients based on their name that we know tend to maybe not be the best quality ingredient, but generally overall from our ingredient panel, we are only seeing what's in the food and we really don't know what it means in case of quality. Now, when you look at your ingredient deck, you're going to see the ingredients listed here, and they're listed in order by weight prior to cooking. So why is this important? Well, high moisture ingredients like fresh chicken are going to lose fat and water when they're cooked. And so they're going to start to move down the ingredient deck a little bit. And so ideally what we want to see on our dog or cat foods bag, because cats are obligate carnivores, they must get what the nutrients they need from eating meat. Dogs are omnivores, though they're kind of on the carnivorous side of that. We know that they do best when they're eating a higher meat content. So ideally, we want to see a couple of animal ingredients listed towards the beginning of that ingredient deck, and not so many plant ingredients. And what we're going to see is, again, as the water, you cook the product, the fat and the water start to move. And so we're going to move on to another question that talks about a powdered ingredient and how that plays into it. But unfortunately, we can't really get a whole lot from the quality based on the ingredient deck, simply because AAFCO limits us as to what we can actually say as we're listing and labeling the ingredients.
Okay. Well, let's move on to another true-false question. The name of the food lets you know what stage of your pet's life it is formulated for. True or false? The life stage is stated in the name of the food. Okay, 84% of our participants this evening feel that that statement is false.
Okay, so I would agree with most of you unless it says something in the name of the food that it is specifically for kittens or puppies or all life stages. We're seeing a movement now among pet food manufacturers that we are starting to see the life stages the food is listed for within the title of or the flavor of the food. But we're gonna, the only place to really understand where we can find what the life stage is for is actually on the nutritional adequacy statement or the AAFCO statement. And so sometimes this can be a little challenging to find on your bag. Sometimes it's going to be on the side panel. Sometimes it's going to be right under the guaranteed analysis. Sometimes it's on the back. And the words that you want to look for would be the name of the product. So in this case, Raw's dehydrated chicken, turkey, and chicken recipe. Food is formulated to meat. So I'll give everybody just a second to see if they can find that on their pet food bag. But this AAFCO or nutritional adequacy statement is the only place that we know what life stage this food is for, because what we have to do as a manufacturer is we have to take our food, and in the case of being formulated to meat, we break it down and do a complex lab analysis on it and prove to AAFCO, substantiate that our food meets the nutritional minimums or maximums required for a specific life stage. And AAFCO only recognizes 4 general life stages: growth, which would be puppies and kittens; gestation, lactation, which is your pregnant or nursing moms; adult maintenance, which will be any animal over the age of a year to maybe 2 years, depending on when their growth cycle ends; and then all life stages, which means that that food has been proven to meet the nutritional needs of growth all the way through to the adult years. Notice I didn't say anything about senior or weight management or hairball. Those are not recognized life stages. There is some, regulations around, if you call it reduced fat, it has to be a certain percentage of fat lower than the original formula. But I'm going to read this AAFCO statement here as an example in case anyone doesn't have a bag in front of them. So Raw's dehydrated chicken, turkey, and chicken recipe for cat food is formulated to meet the nutrient levels established by the AAFCO cat food nutrient profiles for all life stages. So again, this AAFCO or nutritional adequacy statement is really the place to go to know exactly which life stage that food has been scientifically proven through lab analysis, if it says formulation, to meet a life stage. Now, in some cases, not very often, you're going to see something that says feeding trials have shown that XYZ food meets the needs of a certain life stage. Now, feeding trials are very expensive to do, but what we do is we feed the animals, whether it's cats or dogs, for a specific number of weeks, and it varies by life stage. It could be 16 weeks, it might be up to 32 weeks. And then we do blood, fecal, and urine analysis to make sure that they're actually getting the nutrients they need, that they're absorbing what they need from the food. Now, again, this is very expensive to do. And so most companies will go with a formulation process versus a feeding trial. But that is another way that you might find which life stage it is meeting.
Okay. On to our next question about AAFCO, and it's a true false question. Only premium quality pet foods have nutritional adequacy or AAFCO statements. True or false? Only premium quality pet foods have nutritional adequacy or AAFCO statements. We have a very educated consumer group tonight. (95% of our 96% of our respondents believe that to be false.
Excellent. Fantastic. It can be really confusing. Some manufacturers and brands out there have, it might be retailers or whomever say, make sure you have that AAFCO statement on your food, and it can be misleading, and they're well intended. We do want to look for that AAFCO statement to know what life stage a food supports. But in reality, even though AAFCO is not a government agency, they work very closely with the USDA and FDA, and each state is able to interpret the AAFCO regulations kind of as they would like to. But it is not legal to sell a complete and balanced pet food in the United States without that AAFCO statement, without proving to AAFCO that the food meets the nutritional needs. The only exception would be as if it is a treat or a not complete, like a topper, where instead of seeing an AAFCO statement, you will see this food is intended for intermittent or supplemental feeding only. And so if you see that statement, that means it does not have all the vitamins and minerals to be complete and balanced, and it should only take up about 10 to 20% of your pet's diet. But unfortunately, the AAFCO statement really just means that this food has met the nutritional minimums. Your pet shouldn't develop a nutritional deficiency while eating it, but it doesn't tell us anything about the quality of the food.
So in addition to what we can learn from the pet food bag itself, or what we cannot learn from the pet food bag itself, there are some confusing terms in relation to pet food. So maybe we should talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to our next question. I'm going to move on to our next question. What does natural mean in relation to pet food? Is it a food that does not contain any chemical or synthetic ingredients? A food that contains only real meat or whole food ingredients? Or a food made with only high quality ingredients? What does natural mean? Okay. 73% of our attendees this evening believe that it is a food that does not contain any chemical or synthetic ingredients. 17% believe that it is a food that contains only real meat or whole food ingredients. And 8% believe it is a food made with only high quality ingredients.
So I love these responses. This is a very confusing term. 73% of you got the actual definition of the term correct, but I understand why the other percentages answered the way that they did. And so natural, technically by the AAFCO definition, is a food that does not have any chemical or synthetic ingredients. And what you may see sometimes is a food that's called natural plus vitamins and minerals. And that's because sometimes as a manufacturer, we do have to use the synthetic version of a vitamin for shelf stability because we need that food to be able to stay safe and viable on the shelf without needing refrigeration. But in general, natural, unfortunately, doesn't tell us anything about the quality. I mean, a little bit, I guess, where we're not going to have any, added color enhancers or flavor enhancers that are chemical in nature. So it tells us a little bit about the quality of the food. But in general, it's a very deceiving term. It doesn't mean that we're just using whole or fresh meats. It doesn't even necessarily mean that the meats that we're using are of the highest quality. It just tells us that we're not typically adding those color additives, flavor enhancers, or chemically altering the ingredients in any other way.
Okay. Another term that seems to be confusing, and it is what is a meal? So is a meal, is it what we feed our pet once or twice a day? A concentrated source of protein, or a powdered ingredient created by a process where water and fat are removed? And I know also that, we talk about meals in relation to, chicken meal or beef meal. Maybe when we have our answers to these questions, to our poll questions, you can also talk about, is meal necessarily a good ingredient or a bad ingredient? So half of our group believe that a meal is a powdered ingredient created by a process where water and fat are removed. 28% feel the answer is a concentrated source of protein, and 17% feel it is what you feed your pet every day.
Right. And no one here is really wrong, to be honest. But the technical definition of a meal is going to be that powdered ingredient that's been processed to have water and fat removed, because we can have a plant-based meal, which may or may not be high in protein. And depending on the quality of meal, even a chicken meal, it may or may not be high in protein. And this is kind of the confusing, deceiving part of a meal. Now, inherently, meals are not bad. Let's face it, when you're trying to make a pet food and you want to have a high animal source of protein, because remember how I said that water and fat cooks out in the cooking process, having that concentrated protein source can be very helpful. So let me first explain how meals are made. So a meal, depending on the quality, is typically going to be the muscle meat with or without the accompanying bone or skin. And this is if it's a named animal meal, like a chicken meal, a lamb meal. We cook it at high temperatures to remove the water and fat and make a powdered ingredient. So we're cooking it once, then we add it into the rest of our ingredients to cook it again to make the pet food. So one of the downsides of a meal is that it is a highly processed ingredient. We are cooking it multiple times at high temperatures, which means we are starting to break down the amino acids a little bit that are found within that protein, which is what our pets need for optimum health. So again, it's not inherently a bad ingredient. It's just that it's a little over processed. And so, we want to see a combination of fresh meats and or meals or dehydrated meats on the ingredient deck. We would rather not have it be all meals. We want to get some fresh meats in there that are only being cooked once into that pet food, as well as that combination of meals. Now, the grade of meal is important. And unfortunately, the only way to find out what grade of meal a manufacturer is using is by contacting that manufacturer. We're actually not allowed to put that information on the package. And oftentimes, some companies will talk about it, some won't. On the ingredient deck, if you see that it's listed, say, chicken meal, and sometimes it'll say a good source of glucosamine and chondroitin, that doesn't mean it's a bad quality meal, but it means that there is enough cartilage and bone in there to help provide that, hip and joint health with that glucosamine and chondroitin. And so it's important to learn the quality of meal for us to know. And a way that you might be able to start to find this out, because this can be very, very deceiving, is by looking at how much you have to feed your pet. So for example, if I can feed a 50-pound dog 2 to 2 1/4 cups of a food, but of a different food, I have to feed 3 to 4 cups of food, I can start to assume that the food that I have to feed 3 to 4 cups to a 50-pound dog is using ingredients that are less digestible, less bioavailable to my pet's body or my dog's body, which means that it is using lower quality ingredients. Whereas when I can feed less of that food, which also means that there's less poop to pick up, they're using higher quality ingredients that are more bioavailable or easy to digest for my dog or cat, and therefore using more quality ingredients. So while it's hard to tell the quality of the ingredients from the guaranteed analysis or from the ingredient deck, we can start to figure it out based on how much of that food we need to feed. And I know we have a lot of questions coming in the chat, Claudia, so I'm assuming we're just going to answer those at the end.
Yes, we are.
Great. And somebody just asked a question about feathers. We're getting to that, I promise.
Okay. And I was going to also mention that we also see vegetable meal sometimes in pet foods as well as like corn gluten meal, but we don't need to get necessarily into that this evening. Let's move on to byproducts. Another confusing term, byproducts. Another true-false question, are byproducts are bad, true or false? Oh, the early answer is 100% false. Ooh.
Oh, this one's exciting.
It is exciting. I'm very excited. We're a 50-50 split, everybody. I don't know if you can all see the numbers changing. Okay, we've had a couple seconds with no activity. So, wow, that's a cool answer. I'm very excited about this. 58% false, 41% true. Take it away, Jody.
Yeah, I love that this was almost a 50-50 split, and for a little while that it was 50-50, because ultimately it actually just depends. What are we talking about when we talk about byproducts? So byproducts are anything that essentially is like a leftover part of what we're doing, but there's so many cool ingredients that are considered a byproduct, like organ meat, chicken hearts, turkey necks. Those are byproducts. So when we have a named ingredient that would be considered a byproduct, like a heart, an organ of any type, it's actually a really cool ingredient, and it's not a bad ingredient. But where we want to be aware of byproducts is when we see something like byproduct meal. We could have chicken byproduct meal. We might have poultry byproduct meal, just as a couple of examples. And let me explain why this is not a preferred ingredient. So when it just simply lists byproducts, we don't know what we're getting. It could be a really cool mix of organ meat, which is awesome, but it could also include some not so favorable parts like beaks and feet. Now, beaks and feet are great sources of glucosamine and chondroitin, so again, inherently aren't bad. You can walk in a cherry book and probably buy yourself a chicken foot for your dog or your cat, right? Because they're not bad themselves. But here's the downside. Because it doesn't specify, because it says byproducts and it doesn't say chicken hearts or chicken feet, what's in that byproduct meal can change from batch to batch. So we don't know what we're getting from bag to bag of pet food. One time it might be beaks and feet and hearts. The next time it might be livers and beaks and feet. We don't know. It can change. So if it says chicken byproduct meal, it's always going to come from chicken. If it says something like poultry byproduct meal, now we don't even know which bird we're getting these ingredients from. So one time it could be chicken beats and turkey hearts, and the next time it could be turkey feet and chicken livers. We don't know what we're getting. So it's this inconsistency in what we might be getting that's really where we want to take a little bit of pause. But when we have byproducts like even egg whites or again, organ meat, and it's named, we know what we're getting. Byproducts can actually be really cool and nutritious ingredients.
Okay. Another confusing term, human grade. What does human grade mean? Human grade means a food made from ingredients that are approved for people to eat, food made with ingredients fit for humans and made in a plant where human food is made, a food that is safe for humans to eat. Get some variation on this one too. This is cool. Okay. Okay. Half of our participants this evening believe that it is a food made from ingredients that are approved for people to eat. 28% of food made with ingredients fit for humans made in a plant where human food is made, and 18% food that is safe for humans to eat.
Oh, another great batch of answers, another great response. So this is probably one of the most controversial and confusing terms that's being used by pet food manufacturers today. So first and foremost, the actual definition for something to be considered a human grade food, meaning everything in the bag, human grade, that food must be made in a human food facility. And here's why. There are slightly different manufacturing practices between a pet food facility and a human food facility. Let's say that I take the best quality dehydrated chicken. It is human grade. It is fit for human consumption. But I'm going to make it in a pet food facility. The moment that beautiful human grade dehydrated chicken crosses the doorway into that pet food facility, it is now considered no longer safe for human consumption. And that is because of the differences in the manufacturing practices. So in order for a food to be truly considered human grade, it must be made in a human food facility. But you will hear some manufacturers talking about how they might use some human grade ingredients. Here's the tricky part. If their food isn't made in a human food facility, we have no way of knowing if that's actually true, because when that possibly human grade ingredient enters the pet food facility, it is now no longer considered fit for human consumption. So I would just say that when you're looking at foods and someone is saying that their food is human grade, the only way it would be able to be listed on the package itself is if it has been proven to be made in a human food facility. You don't see a whole lot of that. It's very controversial. It's not something that's done standard practice. But if they're saying it's human grade, the follow-up question would be, well, is it made in a human food facility? Because if it isn't, we really have no way of proving that those ingredients were truly human grade.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to some confusing concepts. And we'll start with a concept that a lot of people talk about. A higher protein percentage means my pet is getting more meat. Is that true or false? When you purchase a food with a high protein percentage, does that mean that there's more meat in that food? Okay, wow. 94% of our participants this evening believe that statement is false, that a higher protein percentage does not mean that there is more meat in the food.
Wow, this is a really educated audience, and that is fantastic. So that is absolutely correct, that when we look at the protein on the bag, that percentage of protein in the guaranteed analysis, that is coming from all protein sources, including plants, because we can get protein from plants. And so something to keep in mind when you're looking at that is what is on the ingredient deck. Again, we should see a combination of fresh and either meal or dehydrated animal sources. And ideally, we're seeing, 2 or 3 of those at least in the first few ingredients. Maybe then we'll have some plant ingredients, but we should see some more animal ingredients. And that's how we can start to figure out if we're getting more of our protein from animal than we are from plant. And again, going back to that feeding guideline, how much do you have to feed your cat or dog? A food that is using more animal ingredients for protein will be more digestible than a food that uses more plant ingredients, simply because of the physiology of our dogs and cats. They don't digest starches or carbohydrates as well as we do, or plant matter as well as we do. They actually lack sufficient enzymes to do so, especially cats. Dogs are a little better at it. So if we have to feed more of a food than another, we can also start to say, okay, I'm going to guess that more of that protein might be coming from plant than is actually coming from animal.
Okay. Our next confusing concept, true or false, kibble is easy for my pet to digest. True or false? Okay. 86% of our participants this evening feel that is false, that kibble is not necessarily easy for my pet to digest.
All right. So in general, dry food or kibble is going to be a little harder for our pets to digest than a fresh or raw food. But the more minimally processed a dry food is, the better quality the ingredients, the more likely and better able our pets will be to digest it. And so it really just depends on the specific brand. How do we know? Once again, if we look at those feeding guidelines, the less I can feed my pet based on the feeding guidelines, and the feeding guidelines are just a guideline. Often you can end up feeding even a little bit less than what's there. But if one food is saying you need to feed 3 to 4 cups to a 50-pound dog, and another food is saying you can feed 2 and a quarter cups to a 50-pound dog, we can guess that that one that you can feed less of is definitely going to be a little bit more digestible.
Okay. Our next question. Foods higher in moisture like raw or canned pet food are lower in protein. True or false? High moisture equals low protein. True or false?
Claudia, we do have somebody whose audio stopped working, so they're wondering if there was a way to call in to hear.
That's a good question. I do not know midstream if there is a way. If they go back to their original link to the webinar, there may be a phone, because it's not like Zoom where you can dial in or computer it or go in on your computer. So, but if you go back to your original link, you might have information there. Okay, and poll, 81% of the respondents feel that is false.
All right, excellent. Again, well-educated consumers and pet parents here. So when we compare some guarantee analysis, if we look at low moisture foods like a dry food like a kibble or a freeze-dried food, compared to high moisture foods like a raw food from the freezer or a canned food, it looks very different. And it looks like there's lower protein and fat in those high moisture foods than in the dry moisture foods. But it is the moisture that throws this off. Now, everyone is going to receive in an email a guide, how to read a pet food label, that will actually go into further detail about the things we've been talking about this evening. And in there, it gives you the equation of how you could figure out how to compare these products. Because when we look at a low moisture food compared to a high moisture food, we're really comparing apples to oranges. And there's some very simple basic math that you can do. And I won't bother going into it here because it'll be completely confusing, but it's in that guide that you'll receive. You can actually learn how to compare apples to apples by removing the water content. And it can be confusing because in this water and this moisture, we do still have nutrients. But when we remove the water, we will see that actually foods like raw from the freezer and canned food tend to actually be higher in protein and fat than our dry foods on the shelf. But again, when you just look at that label, it can be very deceiving.
Okay. On to our next question. Sorry, guys, I have to scroll through all the questions. So there we go. Grain-free foods are low in carbs. True or false? Are grain-free foods low in carbs? Yes or no? True or false? Okay, about 3/4 of our participants this evening believe that is a false statement, that grain-free foods are not necessarily low in carbs. 27% feel it might be true.
All right. High five.
Yay.
To everyone for responding. Double high five to those who said false. Grain-free is a very confusing concept within pet food. There's a lot of confusing things in pet food, to be perfectly honest. But when grain-free came on the market, the concept was to try to feed our dogs and cats more like they would eat in the wild, where they're eating more animal ingredients than they are plant ingredients. But in reality, we have to have starch to hold pet food together, dry food, kibble especially, in order to have it work in the extruder. That's the machine that we generally make dry food or kibble in. It will not stay together in a shape unless we add that starch in. So what we did with grain-free foods, and I mean we as the industry, not specifically Roz, but we as the industry, swapped out the grains like wheat and oats and barley and rye and switched it for non-grain starches. Potatoes was the biggest one when it came out. And then we might also use peas, sweet potatoes. Now we're seeing a lot more legumes coming onto the scene, lentils, navy beans, garbanzo beans. Grain-free does not mean low carb. Now, there's a simple trick that you can use to estimate the carb content of a food. It's not exact unless you know the ash or mineral content. This information is in the guide, but I'll tell you quickly. The 4 things that are required to be on your guaranteed analysis: protein, fat, fiber, and moisture. If you add those up and subtract them from 100, that remaining number is a pretty accurate estimate of how many carbs are in that food. And so you can actually compare your grain-free to grained foods and actually figure out which one is going to be the lower carb for you. And really, ideally, we should be looking at foods that are below 30% carb. It would be even better if they're below 25% carb if you want to make sure you're going with a low carb food for your pet. We can use that information to figure that out, but it's grain-free does not mean low carb. And I know we've had a couple of people asking questions about specific ingredients and such. We're going to be getting the questions in just a few moments here, and we'll try to address as many of those as we can.
Okay. And this is our final presentation question. Do you feed raw or fresh food to your pets? Yes, every day. My pets are 100% raw or fresh fed. I add a bit of fresh or raw to my pet's kibble every day. Occasionally I do. No, I have not tried feeding raw or fresh food to my pets. Give you guys a few seconds to answer. All right. Okay, 37% of our participants this evening have not tried feeding raw or fresh food to their pets. 23% do on occasion. 27% add a bit of fresh or raw to their pet's kibble meal daily. And 11% are raw feeders, are entirely raw or fresh fed pets.
Awesome. I love this mix and this blend. This is fantastic. So I want us to think for a moment. So quickly, just to define, in case we're not fully aware, raw would be it's in the freezer. It has not been cooked in any way, shape, or form. Fresh would be, either we're adding it, some fruits and vegetables to our pet's food, or it has been gently cooked. Maybe it's been lightly dehydrated, but it's more of that fresh food. It's not in that dry kibble form. And so I want us to think for a moment about, the way that we might eat. And maybe we might have a salad because we understand the health benefits of having some of those raw vegetables, but we might have it with a piece of pizza or with a cheeseburger. We don't need to be completely raw vegan ourselves in order to get some of the health benefits of raw, fresh food. And so the same is true for our pets. We know that fresh and raw, the more minimally or less processed a food is, the more minimally processed a food is, the easier it is for our systems to digest it. The easier it is for our pet system to digest it. The more natural nutrients we're retaining in that food, which again is better for the body and more bioavailable. But it doesn't have to be all or nothing. So we could simply top our pet's food with a little bit of fresh food. We could offer it for my dogs personally. They get some raw meaty bones once or twice a week. That's the bulk of how we do raw fresh food, because I was this meme. My dog, when I forgot to thaw his food again, because for me, raw feeding just didn't fit my convenience and my schedule. And so I add in some fresh. So this is where we kind of transition into that concept of what does the best food for your pet look like? And I know we had some questions in the chat about what do I feed my pet? How do I find the best food for my pet? And so what we hope is that the information you've learned about, you know, how to read a pet food bag and some of these confusing terms and some of the ways that marketing plays into what we see for pet food bags and labels, to use that information to start to decipher what might be a better food for your pet. And you also need to consider what's going to be a good fit for you. So things to think about: how much time do you want it to take to prepare your pet's food? How much effort do you want to put into it? What's the cost that you're looking for? There is nothing wrong with finding a food that fits your budget. You can find the best food within your budget for you and your pet. And then convenience. Do you want to just be able to open the bag, pour it into the bowl and go, or open the can? Or are you okay with having to thaw something out before you feed it? So these are all questions to consider and think about when you're thinking about food for your pet. Again, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can add a little bit of fresh or raw food on a weekly basis, you know, even a couple of times a month, and you'll start to get some of those health benefits. And again, it might be in the form of a treat like a bone, or it might be, you know, some freeze-dried or dehydrated that maybe you add on top of the kibble, or maybe you get some raw food and you just feed it as a couple of meals here and there to help them get those fresh benefits. But it's really to each their own. It's what's best for you and what's best for your pet. And each of you is unique. So some things to think about for your pet would be: how old are they? Because we do want to keep in mind how that plays into their activity level. If they're less active, we may not need food that is as high in fat. What are their allergies? Do they tend to have any issues with digestive issues? And ultimately then, what are the benefits that you're looking for? Obviously, you want your pet to be the healthiest possible, but are you looking to hopefully reduce some stool volume so there's less poop to pick up? Do you have any specific health concerns that you're concerned about? If you have an older dog, maybe you're looking for, some type of hip and joint benefits to a food, or maybe you're going to supplement that. But again, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It's okay to consider what works for your schedule and your life. We can add in some fresh and raw options, even if we primarily stick with the convenience of a kibble or a canned food.
All right.
All right, so this right here, and I know you can't really read it very well, but this is an example of the guide that you're going to get. It's called What's in Their Bowl: How to Read and Decode a Pet Food Label. On the second to last page is a checklist, 10 things to look for in pet food that you can use to evaluate your current food or use to evaluate some new foods as you walk down the pet food aisle. And then the very last page talks about raws specifically, but this guide is really designed to help you find the best fit for you and your pet. That may or may not be raws, and that's okay with us. We want your pets to find the best fit for you and for them. But this is something that will be sent out in an email to everybody so that you have this as a resource to use.
All right. So we're going to show a little video from Jim and Janet Scott, the owners of Raws. But before we do that, I don't usually do that, I just want to say a word, and excuse me, I don't mean for this to sound sappy or like a commercial. But you may know that at Cherrybrook, we care a great deal about what's in the bag. It's a huge factor when we decide which brands to carry. But there are other ingredients as well that factor into our decision. Things like experience, differentiation, dedication to pet and pet only, passion and purpose. Raws and the owners, Jim and Janet Scott, epitomize all of the above. As the family behind Old Mother Hubbard and Wellness, one of the original natural premium pet food brands, they did not need to re-enter the world of pet food after stepping away. They did not need to create Raws. Raws is a labor of love for them, and it's a mission for the Scott family. And we'll share a video so that you can see why. Play video. There we go.
So Raws nutritional platform is to have high meat, but as importantly, minimally processed. We wanted to give an alternative to consumers that just don't buy raw. And everything that we use that's dehydrated is all human grade. and we know where it's coming from, so we have complete visibility.
So we started Roz after talking about it with our family. We decided we would donate 100% of the profits to providing service animals, traumatic brain injury, and spinal cord causes.
The Roz conversation kind of started with that whole idea around, like how much people don't have access to service dogs or can't afford them because of the high cost.
We have three children, and in 2005, our youngest son had a spinal cord injury from a fall. Almost a year later, our middle son had a horrific car crash and sustained a traumatic brain injury.
I know from my own experience, not always great times in early recovery. Boomer was my reason to get out of bed.
We think, and have always felt, animals are spiritual, and they make such a huge difference in everyone's life. But we felt we had to do this. It wasn't just wanting to do it. And when you're blessed to be able to do something like that, to give back, it's a wonderful feeling. And the motivation for Roz is so fundamentally different.
Working with families with spinal cord injuries and brain injuries just seemed like the most logical next step.
Pets are great, even if it's not a service dog. They do a service for all of us.
I think what's super important to us is a belief in animals, that they actually make a difference to people, and a commitment to family. That's the driver for us.
Oh, Claudia, you're muted.
Sorry, I was muted. So with that, let's get to some of the questions, Jody. And we can go, if you have some time, we can go a little bit beyond, because I know there were some questions that came in. Susan asks, how can one food be okay for all life stages? I thought there were different requirements for puppies versus adult dogs, for example.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So when a food is substantiated to meet all life stages, essentially there's a lot of overlap between those life stages, where puppies and kittens are going to need more vitamins and minerals. They typically need more protein and fat, but adults are going to need kind of somewhat similar to that as well. And so what an all life stage food does is it makes sure it has enough for those puppies and kittens, which means there's definitely enough for those adults as well. There's very few ingredients that we're concerned about giving too much of. I will put a little asterisk next to that to say, when you have a large or giant breed dog or puppy, we are concerned about fat levels, calcium, and phosphorus in relation to growth. So on that nutritional adequacy statement, you will actually now see, this is relatively new within the last about 5 years or so with AAFCO, that it'll say it's substantiated or formulated to meet all life stages, and it will say, including the growth of large breed dogs, 70 pounds or more as an adult, or not including the growth of large breed dogs. So if you do have a large or giant breed dog, you will want to look for that on that adequacy statement to make sure that it does have the recommended levels of fat, calcium, and phosphorus, to make sure that we're not creating too fast of a growth spurt.
Okay. Karen, you're looking for recommendations for some great freeze-dried foods. You can stop into any Cherrybrook store, and we'll be very happy to give you some recommendations and even some samples.
Karen had one more question too, and I want to kind of comment on if it's the same Karen, that they just switched to raw,
yes,
and that the older dog has some larger stool. So just so you know, when you go from a more processed food to a less processed food, it is not abnormal. So it is normal to have actually a larger stool volume at first, because the body is actually able to move out some stuff that it wasn't able to move out before. And then after, it could vary by the animal, but generally after a few weeks, you start to see that stool volume really reduce as they're digesting more of the food, and they've been able to move out some stuff that might have been sluggishly in their intestines for a while. Okay.
Is Roz a dehydrated raw food?
No. So Roz is a cooked food. However, we use a dehydrated chicken as our concentrated protein source, and we cook our food for about a minute at 175 degrees. So we try to keep it as minimally processed as possible, but we do hit that cal step, so we are considered a cooked food.
Okay. Gail asks, doesn't meal include bones and other parts of the protein sauce. Yeah.
Yeah. So meal can include, again, if it says chicken or chicken meal, even the word chicken. So when you see chicken on the ingredient deck, that can be the muscle meat with or without the accompanying skin or bone. And so again, it comes down to the quality of that chicken. So the same thing for chicken meal. It can be that flesh with or without the accompanying skin or bone. And so again, if you're able to feed less of the food with lower stool volume, chances are we're getting more of that muscle meat, less of that skin and bone. And remember, skin and bone aren't bad. Those are still good ingredients to have. We just want to have them in the right proportion so that we're getting enough of that protein from that meat, and then the skin and bone to accompany with the fat, and also the glucosamine and chondroitin that can come in the minerals from the bone.
Okay. Here's just a raw specific question. Does your canned food lining contain PBA?
All of our cans and pouches are BPA free. And I did see a question in here before about, not one food is best for all pets, and you're going to recommend raws. And I said it before, and I'll say it again. Of course, we think raws is great. We work for raws. I work for raws. But it is not going to be the best fit for every person and every pet. And that's okay. What matters most to us is that you're finding the food that works best for your pet, and that you feel empowered to be able to pick up a bag of any food and understand a little bit more about what's in that bag based on the label.
Okay. And then T asks, my 12-year-old Siamese can no longer eat dry. He throws it up. But he misses his crunchies. Any suggestions?
So it would really just depend on your cat. So cats taste based on texture. They have all these little barbs on their tongues. I know there was a great webinar that was done with another company that talked about that a little bit. And so, canned food is a great option. You can try adding a little bit of water to some wet food to some dry food to soften it. Your cat may or may not eat it. It depends on your cat. You could maybe just pick up a couple of great cat treats to give him a couple of little crunchy treats that he can kind of mouth and work with. And then just have the bulk of his food be more of a soft, moist food. Obviously, raw or dehydrated or freeze-dried is going to fit that bill, as well as being easier to chew.
Okay.
I know I saw some questions about pea protein, potatoes, lentils, legumes, DCM, grain-free.
What is the ideal crude protein, crude fat, and crude fiber and moisture percentage?
That is a really tough question to answer because it really depends on your pet. Mm-hmm. So we believe at Raws in high protein coming from animal ingredients, moderate fat, and then low carb. So obviously you're not going to see carb listed on the ingredient deck, but you can kind of figure it out. So it really just depends on the energy needs of your pet. So higher protein, the better, just simply because we know that our dogs and cats need protein to thrive. And then fat content, if you have, moderately active animals, you can get by feeding them a little bit less with a higher fat food. If you have really low active pets, low activity animals, a little bit lower fat might be better. But if there's really high active pets, you may have to go with a food or you can supplement with goat's milk, which is a great fat source, as well as other amazing benefits and nutrients to up the fat content if you feel like your pet is maybe super active and they need a little bit more as far as energy concerned. But fat is the most efficient and effective energy source. It's actually even better than carbs for our dogs and cats. And so if you need that higher energy, you want to look to adding a little more fat. And again, goat's milk is a great option. Raw meaty bones, that marrow in the center is pure fat. So those are some really great sources to add as well.
Right. I'm anxious to talk about controversial. I'm anxious to talk about controversial ingredients like lentils and potatoes. It's been difficult to feel happy about feeding Kibble since all the issues with DCM.
Yeah, so I'll touch on this briefly and just kind of share some of the information that's come out in this study. And I will just recommend that you do your own research as well, because this is a highly controversial issue. So what we know at this point is that the study that came out saying that grain-free foods are causing dietary dilated cardiomyopathy, or DCM, or essentially heart disease for dogs, has been disproven. We know that it's not grain-free foods necessarily. We do know that there may be something going on. And so what's coming into question now are things like legumes, peas and lentils and garbanzo beans and that type of thing. What I will say to you is that we know that dogs and cats need animal protein, and it's because of the amino acids that are in those proteins. Taurine is one of them, but there's also methionine. And, we want to make sure that they have the right amino acids. So my suggestion would be you find the minimally processed food that is going to have those amino acids, and you find foods that have a lot of animal ingredients to make sure that we're getting more of the protein from animal than we are from plant. And I think that's kind of the safer path to go. It's not that all kibble is bad. Again, we have zero proof that grain-free foods are causing DCM. And out of I can't remember the exact number, however many millions of dogs in the country, the study that was done showed 432 dogs that developed it. So it was less than like 0.1% or something. So it was a very kind of skewed research that was done. And they are looking into it more. They're doing more research. But again, talking to your vet, possibility of supplementing with taurine, if we think that might be the way to go, or, adding in some fresher raw food, and then making sure we're having those higher meat content dry foods that you might be using. And it could be a grain-free food. It could be a food with grains, but making sure we're really focusing on animal ingredients is, I think, going to be the way to go with that.
Okay. Raw food used to be related to worm infestations. Is that still true when it is freeze-dried? Do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So when you talk about a prepared raw food that's sold in a pet store, there are really stringent FDA guidelines on what is allowed to happen with these foods. Believe it or not, raw pet food can have 0 bacteria on it, whereas the raw chicken we buy in the grocery store is allowed to have up to 11% salmonella on it. So I would say that if you are using a prepared raw food that is coming from a pet store, that is either going to be complete and balanced, or it's going to tell you what you need to add to make it complete and balanced. The concerns for worms or bacteria is extremely minimal. And so if you're going to the butcher and just grabbing some random meat and maybe you're not familiar with how to do that, that might be more of where a concern might be coming from. But again, prepared pet food, raw food, all the food in the store, not allowed to have any type of bacteria or worm contagion or anything like that.
Okay. I mean, I remember back in the day when you could go into a pet store and you can get, a 10-gallon drum of, sadly, horse meat that, just came out of the rendering plant or the, and I could see that, or roadkill. There was times where you could get roadkill as well, and people would feed that to their dogs, and some people still do. And where you're getting game that hasn't been processed or treated, or isn't human grade, because most of the raw meat, the protein that goes into raw food, like Jody said, that is in a prepared pet food brand, raw pet food brand, is human consumption meat. So raw is safe in the pet food, and so is freeze-dried. Okay. I'm concerned about fish products, mercury and iodine, that can cause hypothyroidism in older cats.
Yeah, so I think this is a great concern. And so what I would recommend you do is that you go to the manufacturer's website or contact the manufacturer. They should be able to provide that information for you as far as what level is in the food products that they have. Because, it's understandable that we want to keep those things down for sure. And right. Unfortunately with fish, it's difficult because especially if they're ocean caught, even if they're farmed, we use ocean, wild caught fish, but it's just, with what we're doing with our environment, it's becoming more and more of a concern. So again, I would just suggest that you contact the manufacturer to get that information for the food that you're either interested in or that you're feeding.
Right. And also, the smaller the fish, like a herring or a sardine, generally has a lower amount of, less mercury in it, because it is, it's a smaller fish. It hasn't been swimming around in the ocean as long to absorb the contaminants that come from the ocean. So
when you're looking at tuna, if you can find foods that use a skipjack tuna, that's a smaller tuna than your standard albacore enormous tuna. So there's less of a concern there.
Okay. Which ingredients are cats most allergic to? That's kind of a hard question to answer, but do you want to give it a go?
Yeah, again, it depends on the individual animal. And we often think about allergies and we focus primarily on food, but we have to remember that environmental allergies play a part as well. If you think of the immune system like a cup, and trust me, I'm going to get to where I'm going here. Don't mind me drinking coffee at 8 o'clock at night. But if we think of the immune system as a cup, I might have a huge environmental allergy like dust mites or grass or something like that, believe it or not. And then maybe I have a slight allergy to chicken, then I have a slight allergy to potato. And then the next thing I know, I'm having this huge immune reaction because my immune system is just sort of overflowed. But the biggest allergen was actually that environmental allergen. So it's hard to tell you what the top allergens are, but typically we see that chicken is a high allergen. I did see somebody asking if Roz has a chicken-free food. For dogs, we do. For cats, we don't yet in the dry food, but we do in our wet foods. So chicken tends to be a big one, and then it just depends. It depends on the pet. We see lots of times that wheat can have an issue, corn can have an issue. But I would say that it's just going to be trial and error with your individual pet. Sometimes it's the environmental factor as well. If you've recently shampooed the carpets, changed your laundry detergent, moved to a new home, if you smoke within the home, these are all things that can actually increase environmental allergens. And so sometimes if we can kind of reduce the environmental allergens, we find that any food sensitivities are not as big of a deal anymore.
Right. For the active boxer agility dog, I need carbs. How much?
Great question. So there are definitely some sources online that you can use to calculate the caloric needs of your individual pet. I believe we actually have a blog article now on our website or coming soon about how much do you feed, and it gives you some idea of how to calculate what you would need. And I would actually challenge whether it's carbs or fat that might be a better fit for your pet. It just depends on your pet. Some do great digesting those carbs and others do better when they have a higher fat versus carb content.
Right. Fat is very important as an energy source. Carbs are important, but also balancing that. Mm-hmm. So, okay. Okay.
I see a question about if a dog was diagnosed with cancer, is raw better? And so, talking with your vet is going to be key here. But again, where raw is or minimally processed, less processed foods, raw foods are easier for the body to digest. Oftentimes it can be recommended to go with a less processed food to allow the pet's body to have more energy to fight the cancer. But I would definitely talk to your vet and the oncologist about it, see what they might recommend as far as what might be the best fit for your individual pet.
Okay. This is actually a good question. Is the adequacy statement based on based upon the recommended feeding amount for the weight of the dog? What if the dog receives less than that amount?
Right. So that's a great question. So the adequacy statement basically says that food has met the nutritional minimums. And so if you have a 50-pound dog and it says that you should be feeding 2 cups a day, then yes, at 2 cups a day, the dog is getting at least the nutritional minimums. Oftentimes manufacturers go over those minimums, which is okay. That's not a bad thing. So if you're feeding significantly less than the recommended feeding guidelines, you may want to consider looking into some type of supplementation. I know lots of times, especially a few years back, we would recommend to drastically reduce the amount we're feeding our pet and add in green beans to help with their weight loss. That's not really the recommended approach anymore. I would say if your pet is overweight and maybe you're trying to get them to lose weight, you would want to feed them the amount that's recommended for that size. So if your dog was 60 pounds, but they should be 45 pounds, feed the amount recommended for 45 pounds to help them lose that weight. But then we're still making sure they're getting the nutrients that they need for health.
Okay. There are no stores in my area that sell the Raw's line. You can order that from Cherrybrook online, and we will be happy to ship it to you.
Yeah, we're not available on Chewy or Amazon. Amazon a little bit, but only through brick and mortar retailers. So the best bet is to go through Cherrybrook online. We have great partners like Cherrybrook that do our online sales for us, so we don't have to go to somewhere like a Chewy or something like that.
Can you tell me what ingredients make certain foods only by prescription?
Oh, that's amazing. So, let me put my politically correct hat on here. Hang on a second. So it's not always specific ingredients. Sometimes it's the amount of nutrients. So for example, magnesium, phosphorus are huge conversations in the cat world because of urinary crystals, but we're only allowed to go down to like 1% or something like that. We can't go below that. Otherwise, we go below the AFCO min. So in order for us to make what would be considered a prescription low magnesium or phosphorus diet, we would have to go through significant testing through those feeding trials and all that type of thing. So it's not so much the specific ingredients, it's oftentimes the amount of certain nutrients. However, what prescription foods tend to do, and I'm not going to say in all cases, but what they tend to do is recreate an environment in the body with chemically altered or synthetic ingredients. And so they might be using certain amino acids, they might be using certain other ingredients to recreate an environment in the body that oftentimes we can create with raw meat and or high meat food sources. So I would say in having the conversation with your veterinarian, depending on what the specific issue is, asking them if there is an alternative non-prescription food that you might be able to use if you wanted to get off the prescription diet. So again, that's a tricky question because it's not always the ingredient. Sometimes it's the amount of a nutrient that makes it need to be a prescription diet because it falls below what AFCO says is the minimum. Even though we know that the cat or dog might be okay on it, it has to meet those standards and prove that through some pretty stringent trials.
Right. Good answer. Does Roz, it was very politically correct. Does Roz have their own factory or is this food made in an outside factory?
It is made in an outside factory. We do co-pack, which means that we hire a manufacturer to make our food for us. We're a very small company, and where we donate 100% of our profits, it would be very hard for us to have our own manufacturing facilities. We're very fortunate that the Scott family has been in the pet food industry forever. As Claudia mentioned, they're the former owners of Old Mother Hubbard and Wellness. They've been able to use those longstanding relationships to partner with some amazing manufacturers for us. We also use a third party to be on site to audit when the food is being run to make sure that it's hitting our high quality standards.
Are there any specific ingredients that are being linked to cancer in dogs that seems to be becoming more prevalent, especially in giant breeds?
So again, this is sort of a double-edged sword. There's so much happening in our environment, either what animals are eating that then we and our animals eat, or air or water quality, that I don't know that there are some specific foods that are ingredients that are considered to be carcinogenic or that have come into question. I think, again, the more minimally processed we can get, the better it is overall for the body, both ours and our pets. And, minimizing environmental toxins as much as we can. When it comes to things like fragrance, what we're cleaning our floors with, trying to make sure that we're using products that are going to be safe for our pets as well. And it can be hard to do for sure.
Okay. So we have our last couple questions, if we have another few moments. Is raw lamb good for small pets and is kangaroo?
So I would say, again, if you're going to be feeding a raw meat, I would personally recommend going with a prepared pet food raw, unless it's something you've been doing for a long time, just because we know that has 0 pathogens on it. Kangaroo, I don't know about raw kangaroo, but kangaroo in general is a great protein source. It's really high in linoleic acid, so it can be great for skin and coat. And it's also a great novel protein for some pets that might have some allergies.
Right. And then our last question for this evening, this will be our last question for this evening. Which raw's label has the highest fat content?
Ooh, trick question. So our dry foods are actually all at about 12% fat. We stick with a moderate fat content because we believe that if you need to supplement with some fat, it would be best to do it with maybe some goat's milk or some raw meaty bones. Our pate canned food will be the higher fat content among our canned foods. And both our pate canned foods and our dry foods are for all life stages, all breeds, including large breed dogs. And then we have our line of shredded cans and pouches. Those are just for adult maintenance because those are super low fat. So if you're looking for a little higher fat content, our pate cans, and then our dry foods are all at 12% fat.
Okay. I am just going to, since that's our last question, if you have other questions, if anybody has any other questions, I'm just going to type my email address in the chat right now to share with everybody. And you can feel free to email me tomorrow or any given day the questions that you would have, and I would be happy to answer them or find answers for you. Jody, I would love to thank you for this great presentation this evening. We went 15 minutes over, which means that everybody was engaged, and I think the questions were excellent, and you did a wonderful job, and we so appreciate our partnership with Roz and the Scotts, and we thank you for your time this evening. You have truly educated us all. Thank you so much. Everybody, thank you for attending this evening. We appreciate your time and your commitment to your pets. Thank you all.
Thank you,
Have a
everyone.
good evening, everybody.
Thanks so much.